Introduction or? Okay, I'm introduced. So, hello everybody, attentively in the audience. um, who was here last year? Anyone raise your hands? Who was here last year? A few. So, a lot of newbies. Um, the talk I'm going to give today, I'll do a little introduction myself in a later slide. The talk that I'm going to give today is covering a couple of topics, but the overall kind of umbrella is that there's a new war, like there was a war on terrorism, and I'm speaking US centric. There was a war on terrorism, and that had certain elements and interests about it, and before that there was a war on drugs, and we always make a war when we want to motivate people on things. Now cybersecurity is actually, I think there's a reasonable enemy out there. It's not a theoretic enemy, it's a reasonable enemy, and so the talk is biometrics, which is what I spend a lot of time with, is a weapon that it's going to be very critical if we try to protect some of our infrastructure, critical infrastructure, and the things that they're talking about in this newly defined war. So I'll get into some details in a little moment. Anyway, so my name is Mark Tuttle, and I'm a Californian, and I have been living in Austria for 8 years. My Deutsch is bad, so please don't ask me to say too much. I started programming, well, I'll say, first of all, I'm a generalist. That means I have a lot of different interests and I do all kinds of different things. Once a year, I get invited to talk here, and I like to come into the hacker environment because of the, I'll just say the positive kind of outlook of most of the people here. You're stepping out of the normal kind of society that, I'll say a robotic society of consumers, and you're looking at things and you do things and you don't sit around and passively consume experience. You're like going after stuff, and you find something interesting and you go after that. And that's why I've got kind of an affinity for the hacker movement. I'm not like a malicious guy that thinks that everybody should be black hats and should be creating an anarchy, but the point is that looking at things, finding holes, this kind of thing is very interesting, and I appreciate the whole energy of the group, of the hacker community at large, and specifically this group. So glad to be back. So generalist I covered. I have a technical background, and I still work in technology quite a bit, but it's not my only focus. I think I've probably got most of you beat on when I started programming, so that was 1976, and it was on a mainframe computer, and it was using BASIC, and we had no hard drive. We didn't have access to the hard drive. That was sitting in a different location, so we had to save things to paper tape. So you write a program, save it to paper tape, then you have to load it back in the pinhole reader and load your program back into memory, and it was pretty classic. No screens, just a teletype machine, so there were no graphics, but we tried to do graphics with what, like, some people go back to kind of old school, using text in various ways to make pictures. That was the best graphics that we had back in those times. And I was lucky in California because the school that I went to had one computer programming class. And they said, Mark, you should go into this. And I said, I don't know what this is. And they said, you'll like this. This is fine. And that got me started in technology. So there were only 8 of us in the class, and it was a good teacher. And we had one terminal in the corner of the room that was connected to another school that had the Data General Nova 2 mainframe. And it was pretty interesting. Hard drive was about as big as this whole chair. And it might have been 5 megabytes. It might have been. I don't remember what the size of it is. So, okay, so in my technology line of things, the group I work for right now is called BioG, and I work for a guy called Dr. Michael Fisk. And one of the things I'm going to cover of his today is a set of requirements for securing any kind of a system, especially related to authentication, authorization, transaction integrity. And this is kind of a measuring stone or a measuring list that you can measure almost any kind of system against. And so that's why I'll cover it with you guys today, is because I think it's kind of useful, and it's just kind of a way of looking at things a bit differently. And it's, it has architectural implications, it has practical implementations or applications. And so I hope you guys find it interesting. I'll try to do my best on it. And I'll cite where we gave the talk originally and a little background on it when I get into that part of the slides. Last comment, I was trying to put a bit of humor in this, and that is that once a year, and I didn't go this year, but last year before I came here, I had much shorter hair, because this conference I go to that's at the bottom here, it's the Department of Defense National Security Agency Conference on Identity, and they hold one conference a year in America, and when I go to that, I have to get pretty straight looking. So they're not really diverse individuals. They're pretty authoritarian, rule-oriented, all this sort of stuff. But there's still some redeeming social value in those groups, but they're not thinking outside of the box. You guys are probably much more qualified than the people getting paid $100,000 a year to be evaluating security for the CIA. Honestly, they have about that much scope. And I think in this room, I'm guessing you guys have about that much scope. So we'll hope so. Okay, thought of the day, question everything. I think you guys probably understand that, and that's probably what you do a lot of. So it's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. Okay, what's the new war? I use some acronyms in here, and I put links in here. So I'll give the PowerPoint slides to the conference, and then you guys will have links that you can follow up and do deeper diving if you want to look into certain topics. DNI is the Director of National Intelligence in the US, and every year he gives a threat assessment to the Senate. That's part of our parliament. It's called the Senate, to their Security Council. And these are the guys that are in America that are responsible for our security. And they're the guys in America that put all this effort into the war on terrorism because it was a threat, right? And it came from the DNI's report from 2002 that terrorism is a big threat. We've been attacked, blah, blah, blah. Let's go spend cajillions of dollars and protect everyone from security or from the terrorists. I'm a bit sarcastic on that whole thing. Maybe you guys are also a bit sarcastic on that. Anyway, so the report is here. First 2.5 pages of the report this year were on critical infrastructure and cyber attacks. So was not the case the year before. It was like 6 years of terrorism, right? That's our biggest threat. And this year, they finally actually paid attention to something that's important and significant. I'll address why. I mean, you guys already have an idea of how infrastructures are and how things are used and not used by the way they're intended, or not used the way they're intended, and this often leaves a lot of security problems. Of course, they did mention the global economic crisis in the threat assessment, and then the last 20 pages, as I remember, are all articulating that terrorism is still a threat. They have to remind us because we don't get attacked very often. So, or if we get attacked, it's some lone guy in New York City who has an old car with some gasoline in it, and that's supposed to justify spending $1 trillion and fighting 2 wars in different lands by America. That's supposed to justify it, that we're really under threat because there's a guy with a car and some gasoline in Manhattan. So tends to be an overstatement of the seriousness of matters. I think in the cybersecurity world and the critical infrastructure protecting, there's a general lack of understanding right now by the political environment or the political organizations in America. And I'm guessing that America will launch this war, and then every country around the world will put on the cyber security hat and spend a lot of money on trying to make things secure, and it'll be a fashionable war for a while. But how they talk about it will be very interesting. So keep your ears open about the choices and words that they use when they say, this happened, this is a big threat, or that's not a threat, don't worry about that, or we have a solution, we solved it. These kinds of things. The next slide here is, I know there's one guy in the audience that's familiar with this guy. He's raising his hand. Has anybody heard of Leo Strauss? Okay, I have one. You guys, Leo Strauss? Good? Yeah. So if you watch any of the Adam Curtis videos, which I made a reference to Adam Curtis, and I put a link in there for the actual, Google has all the videos from Adam Curtis. He's the best documentary maker that I believe exists right now, and I've learned so much from his stuff. Mark's nodding over there that he also has. I've learned so much. The guy's just really good. You would, when you have a little downtime and you want to watch something that shows the twisty side of reality, you can check out any of the Adam Curtis videos. But they're mainstream in a way also. They're very good editing and great documentary footage, and the guy has access to the whole BBC library from the last 50 years. So he just sits there and watches movies all day and film footages of news programs and pulls out the interesting stuff and then puts it into documentaries. So Leo Strauss is considered the father of the neoconservative movement in America. This is a little technical. This is a deviation from technical, but I'll get to it. Don't worry. Anyways, Leo Strauss recognized a couple of points here that I made. America will disintegrate into ruin because of individual self-interests. He saw this as a problem in society. And so his approach to this, and I'm only paraphrasing, I'm not directly quoting, I'm just kind of give you guys a little view of a guy that most people have never heard of. Anyways, he said, America needs to keep its special place in the world as the protector of freedom and the righter of wrongs, okay, in order to prevent this disintegration. Okay, now why do I say all this stuff? Okay, well, the third point here, because of this need, it's okay to exaggerate or create an enemy if one is not actually present. Okay, that's something he said. That's something that's a theme, an underlying theme of the neoconservatives. And so when this war on cyber infrastructure or cyber crime and infrastructure attacks from national hacking groups from China and all the stuff you see in the news, it'd be very interesting to listen to the words that they choose to use and how they characterize the problems. Just remember that guys like Paul Wolfowitz were students of Leo Strauss's, and Paul Wolfowitz, for example, was one of the main Bush advisors on policy for Iraq, for Afghanistan, for how to deal with terrorism, how to respond to 9/11, and he's one of Strauss's guys. So just be aware that things are often exaggerated. Gulf of Tonkin for the Vietnam War, did anyone ever hear that before? Yeah? Did anyone hear in 1996 when the Secretary of Defense said that that was a completely staged event, that was just an event that was characterized incorrectly to justify escalating the war effort in Vietnam? Okay? Typical Straussian kind of comment. Same thing was done with good intelligence that came out of the CIA during the Cold War, and it was exaggerated and cut it and paste, and they just pulled out the stuff that supported this evil empire that we have to spend more money into the military-industrial complex for in order to fight this big evil enemy, even though they were mostly bankrupt. And anyways, it's just, this happens over and over again, so it'll be interesting to watch how this happens with the cyber threat that's emerging. Now, how big of a problem is the cyber threat? The work I do with BioG, and I'll tell you a little bit about BioG in a minute. The work I do with BioG, we're a research and development firm for security technology. And it means that we have not gotten into products or anything, but we look at security theoretically, and we try to design things that are good and I'll say perfect if possible, as a long-term or maybe short-term alternative to what's currently in place. So anyways, that's just a little bit about where we're coming from. So we don't have a product in a shop, we don't have a system like Cisco, we don't have anything like this. We're just looking to license the technology that we develop. As it sits right now, we have a portfolio of 17 patents that cover an entire identity management platform that I'm going to share with you guys today, this requirements of security, and see what kind of holes you can find in it, and see if you've got some ideas and some thoughts around it. So, and I'll tell you a little bit about the background of that in just a minute. Okay, what's a threat to critical infrastructure? Okay, these are the words that are being used in the DNI report that went to the Senate. The link is on there, so you can actually read the DNI report yourself to see how they chose the words about the cyber threat. It's the first time that, I'll say, hacking has gotten attention at this high of a level in government, and it's, you know, it's spawning a giant movement. So I just picked one, and this is one that's of particular interest to me right now. Is anyone familiar with SCADA as an infrastructure? Yeah, a little bit or a lot? Who's really familiar with SCADA? Anyone? Yes, halb. So yeah, I didn't know anything about it until I met some people, and then they told me about it, and it was very interesting. How about Bruce Schneier, which I think I spelled his name correctly. Does anyone know Bruce Schneier? Yeah, he's one of my security heroes. He's he's very good analyst. He's a very good analyst of security, but also human nature, psychology, how systems work, all these things. You can get a monthly newsletter from him. It's usually about 15 pages. It's all his blog postings and everything. But the guy's very active in producing material and commenting on the security environment that's going on these days. Also, he's rather critical of terrorism and airport security especially. And he had a pretty big battle with the head of the airplane, the TSA, another acronym. The TSA, he had a pretty good battle, somewhat publicly, politely calling them idiots for all of these measures they put into place, all the inconvenience that they cause, and that they really don't increase the security level at all. It's just security theater. That's one of his phrases, security theater. So on SCADA, he thinks it's a hole, and right now, in 2007, he was saying, it's overblown now. That usually is what happens. There's something discovered, it's overblown, then the threats grow slowly and the attacks, and then usually it's forgotten about by the time that the serious damage is being done. So that's just a quote from him. He believes that it's going to become significant. The quote's in orange. Okay, on SCADA, when you do a little bit of research on Google, you just have to type in SCADA hacks or something like that, and you can get a list of a lot of infrastructure compromises that have been done over the last 10 or 15 years. I didn't list them all out here, but a nuclear power plant in the US, the security system or the monitoring system was taken over by a SCADA and infrastructure vulnerability, and for 5 hours they didn't have access to the security system or the monitoring system of an operational nuclear power plant. Example, pipelines, oil pipelines also run on SCADA. SCADA is basically a control, an industrial control language. It's open source. It was designed to be isolated, security by obfuscation or by isolation. They never really put any kind of advanced tools in it like we commonly have in softwares that we use to design applications these days. Anyway, so there's been pipeline things where hackers have gotten in and dumped oil out of pipelines or put sewage, mixed it with clean water into the drinking system. Another article which I have referenced in here, and there's a link, once again, when you get the slides, there'll be a link to this article. They talk about acknowledgments of hacker intrusions in SCADA systems all over the place, but it's kind of hopeful. They say, well, they haven't really done too much, so we don't think that they're going to be malicious. But they're all over these systems. Power systems, water systems, oil systems, oil platforms, they all running SCADA, all this sort of stuff. So just do a search on Google. I think you'll probably find it pretty interesting. And I included a 4-page article, which is what my next slide, 2 slides, is going to be about. So the Computer Chaos Club in 2007, there's a Hacking Critical Infrastructures presentation that was done at their conference. And I put a link to the slides there so that you can get some deep dive and a lot more technical stuff on SCADA. Interesting deck from the Petroleum Safety Authority, trying to educate people that there are risks and that they have to take steps to secure things. I think that was 2007 also. And then there's hackingscada.com, which is actually trying to sell a book on the topic. So these are a couple of references. Okay, now, the 4-page article from, I'll call it a fringe journalism group, Toward Freedom. They're actually talking about the British Petroleum oil platform that's gushing oil into the Gulf of Mexico right now was under hack, and it was actually a targeted a targeted attack to demonstrate what could be done. Okay, because SCADA systems, SCADA is used a lot with monitoring. It's a real-time system. It's used with monitoring and measurements from sensors and coordinating these things on a real-time basis. If you disrupt the real-timeness of it by slowing it down, say kind of a denial of service, or you can put something in there that clogs up the work, then the safety systems don't respond as they're supposed to. So there's not a tremendous amount of forensic evidence to look at with the British Petroleum rig. So did it happen? Did it not happen? I don't know. But human error and failing shut-off valves, okay, could be. There's not really any definitive wording on what actually happened. And everything burned up and sunk to the bottom of the ocean, so there's not going to be any forensics on it. So they're going to basically be able to tell whatever story they want. So should Obama and the group talk about human error and lack of regulations? That seems tangible. Or should they talk about critical infrastructure hacking, which the department or the Director of National Intelligence spoke about? I think it would scare everybody if they talked about that kind of hacking, but there's hundreds of oil platforms that have fairly unsecured SCADA running, and so chances are, if one went down and it was in fact a hacking event, I think we can certainly see that there'll be other things that are going down. The article alludes to the North Koreans as the hackers responsible because the rig was owned by the South Koreans. This particular rig was owned by the South Koreans and was built by one of their industrial companies. And so it might have been a nationalistic kind of attack, don't know. But it's you have to admit, it's kind of an interesting angle on the whole story because CNN's putting 30 minutes a day on the rig, and the CEO of British Petroleum is having to get up there and say, we're going to have it shut off by the time we release our second quarter financials now. That's the latest date. So it's a public relations nightmare. They're supposedly going to shut it off the day that they make a very important financial reporting to the stock markets and the financial markets. And so that's nice timing that they'll get it shut off by that day, but we've heard promises before that haven't been met. If there's a real kind of hacking thing going on here, then all the blah, blah, blah doesn't matter, because it means that all rigs are going to have some portion of a vulnerability, and it'll just be a Russian roulette game. It's like whoever the guys can get into, if they really want to take things down, they can make rather gnarly demonstrations of how stupid the whole infrastructure is and how easy it is from anywhere in the world to make a good attack on it. Oh, shut off the sensors. Oh, we can control the drill speed with, or the pumping speed. Let's turn up the pumping speed really fast. Oh, it might overheat. And if there's no thermal sensor on, then it's just going to run. So SCADA is this way. If there's no, I'll call it integrity and ability to audit and have all kinds of controls built inherently into the code, then you're looking at a nightmare. So that's why I only wanted to talk about that one thing today with SCADA, because that's the thing that's quite interesting. That got my attention. Last little bit is the guy that turned me on to the article. He's a security expert from Zagreb. He's actually got a whole content management platform that he's working on with a dynamic encryption and dynamic routing of encryption sequence, and they've got 3 or 4 patents on their content management system. I'm not a big fan of content management, but the implications of their infrastructure that they've come up with is very interesting to control content and who receives the content, and that can be applied to information just as well as it can be applied to media and those kinds of things. So he's all on this. He's a smart guy, and he spent a year or 2 years looking at SCADA, and then the oil rig article came out, and then he went and he spent a half an hour telling me why it's highly probable that this was a hack. So you guys are hearing about it because I heard about it, and I think it's interesting. I can't say one way or the other, but it's interesting and it's a significant thing. It's not a 1,000 credit card users losing their account information and somebody transferring money in a bank. This is an environmental catastrophe that's costing a company a lot of money, destroying a whole ecology around the Gulf of Mexico. And if it was in fact hacker origin, it's kind of interesting. So, any questions so far? It's fine to ask questions if you guys have questions. If I say something and then you say, oh, I want to know more about that. Any questions so far? No? Good? Are you guys understanding what I'm saying? Is my speaking too fast or my English is, it's okay? Wait, you're not understanding. I was just going, no, I don't understand. You have to synchronize, or we're out of time synchronization with your answer. So, okay. Okay, now along the lines of the guys that I work with, I've learned over the last 3 years that identity systems that are used to provide the integrity and security of most systems are generally weak. Login and password, that worked great before the internet, before there were keystroke loggers, and before there was different ways of phishing and all this sort of thing. But login and password doesn't work. In the business side of things, PKI cards, does anybody know about PKI cards? Maybe, yeah, so, you know, chip and pin or PKI, that's also have been some reasonable attacks against systems that use that. They generally add too many complicated parts around it, and they all have seams, and so there's not really good protection there. And do we know who actually uses the PKI card and the pin? No. It doesn't there's no audit trail back to the human. You don't know who they are, and that's why I titled this thing Biometrics, because unless you actually confirm who the user is as part of the identity process or part of the authentication or authorization process, you've got holes. You've got a hole in the system. So, I'm sorry, was somebody asking a question? I couldn't hear. Oh, okay, good. Could have been a conversation from far away. Okay, now a couple more things. Who thinks we can trust our computers to provide the identity platform? I don't think anybody's going to raise their hand here. I think if I talk to you know, Wirtschaftskammer people in Austria and I ask them that question, they're all going to raise their hands. Of course we can trust it. It's in my office and we have the IT guys, you know. That's a good point, right? The secretaries do, and they dictate emails, right? And the secretaries read the emails to them so that they know about this new internet thingy, right? Yeah, the printout internet thingy, right? So anyway, well, I'm sure that there's some pretty younger people that are in there now, so I don't think it's quite that bad. But certainly in the Geschäftsführers from the larger industries in Austria, unless they're heavy users of the computer, if they're more traditional, this, what you were just saying, print, carry, read a stack of emails on paper, make some notes, and then the secretary or the assistant replies to them, and they're making the decisions on how to fight the cyber battle that looks like it's shaping up to be the next war. So, yes, well, so BlackBerry, I mean, at least it's an IP device in a way, yeah, so can do something. So we can't trust our host computers. Can we trust our browsers? Okay, if you think you're on a site, okay, you know, I mean, untrusted browser attacks are one of the elegant ways of fooling people to do things that they shouldn't do. So we can't trust our computers, we can't trust our browsers. We could never trust the unknown network. We didn't know what was out there. So this is just a little bit of why we have such a fertile environment for general kinds of malicious hacking, or good investigation, or malicious hacking. So I have to cover the white and the black hats at both here. So, so the kind of solution that we should end up with, if we acknowledge that weak identity systems are part of the problem for cyber insecurity, whatever that happens to be, a kind of solution would be strong identity systems. These are kind of high-level political bullet lines that you might find at, you know, in some kind of report that comes out from the government. So strong identity that can't be compromised by current vulnerabilities. Strong identity that can work in mostly untrusted environments, because most of what you use isn't under your control. Even your own host computer is not under your control sometimes. Can be, right? And then also, I mean, if I asked a question, how many of the hacks that show up in the news, like bank hacks, credit card, bank card, all these things, how many of them are from insiders? I'd say it's probably over 50%. You know, if I'm a mafia guy and I'm looking at, okay, well, this bank's interesting. They've got a lot of high net worth individuals and they do stuff online. Out of the 4 or 5 IT guys that have access to the identity portion and the authentication and authorization portion of the network, you know, how many of them need more money or have a gambling problem or like to abuse substances or want a trip to an exotic place with a beautiful girl that will stay with them for 2 weeks? Okay, the point is that that's the way that traditional organizations that are trying to get inside of things that are protected, they just go around to the left side, to the insider, throw some money around or create some kind of a need for them to make a deal, and in 20 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, something's copied off, and the mafia guys have their data that they can then make systematic attacks on the system, and you know, enough information that they can exploit it. So insider threats are incredibly important when you're designing a security system. So with all that sort of setup, that's a long setup, how will this be done? So the guys I work with made a talk, as I mentioned, at this trade show that I go to every year. Except for this year I didn't go, so I didn't have to cut my hair. They came up with a 10 requirements list. And I'll cover the 10 requirements list with you today. And I would appreciate you guys thinking about it from an architectural standpoint and from a security standpoint. What do you think about it? And I'd be interested to get some feedback on that as well from you. So after my talk, if you guys want to give me some ideas. I'm not this uber technical person like the guys that I work with. We have 3 PhDs, and Martin Quiroga is one of the key technical people that worked on the N-Circle infrastructure components and has patents in network and architecture. Dr. Fisk that I work with is a mathematician who's been applying mathematics to security. I'll cover Fisk a little bit more because he's really interesting. I'm lucky to work for him. He's a guy I grew up with in Santa Barbara, and I got a call from a friend that had invested in his company and said, Mark, can you call him and help him out? I've got invested. I'm the first investor in this company, and I need it to work because I need the money. So that's how I got reacquainted with Dr. Fisk. So anyways, as I caught up with Fisk, I learned about what he had been doing. He went to Stanford, where he actually took biology and geology, and then he went to Chicago and started working with artificial intelligence and mathematics, and then he graduated from Northwestern University with a PhD in mathematics. But in his focus, it was large autonomous dynamical systems. So he's looking at the edge or the fringe of mathematics, and that's what's really interesting to him. He's applied those kinds of mathematic principles to security, to obfuscating things that should be there. He's come up with a method to store pins and passwords where they aren't stored anywhere. They're completely mathematically jumbled in a dynamical system, and there's no way to get them out unless you do 5 or 6 things in order correctly, and the steps are different for every single instance of where this password is sort of stored in a virtual state. So this is the kinds of things that he's doing, and because he's such an interesting mathematician from the standpoint of his background, he actually has something significant to offer the marketplace. It's not like the typical mathematicians or security trained guys that are coming out of university that don't have, they don't have this kind of outside specialization in artificial intelligence and machine learning and dynamic systems and all this kind of thing. So luckily, I've had a great teacher over the last 3 years, so he's spent some time trying to educate me about security, because when I got involved with the company to try to help him out, I knew business stuff and I knew some technology, but I didn't know about security per se. So I spent the last 3 years looking at that, and it's very interesting. One point of reference, has anyone here heard of the Church-Turing conjecture? Yeah, Church-Turing conjecture? Does anyone know who Alan Turing is? Alan Turing? Yeah, raise your hands if you know. Yeah? Good. Okay, Alonzo Church was a mathematician Turing, you have to say it louder, I'm sorry. Lambda. Okay, I'm sorry, it's too hard to hear out there. Anyways, he did a paper in 1936 on a calculating machine, the Turing machine, and it's largely the similar model that we use for all our computers today. And this is the guy that I learned about from Dr. Fisk. He said he was very interesting. He also, I can just put this out as a question, Turing wrote a paper on encryption, and it can't be found anywhere. So I imagine somebody thought it was pretty interesting, and so it's not available. Has anyone ever heard of a paper on encryption from Turing? No? Okay, anyway, it's just something on the laundry list of things that I'm looking for to find out what he said. So anyway, so Fisk, along with all the stuff that we're doing in security, to extend his mathematics, he's actually modified the Turing machine by adding a dynamic register system to it. And he is actually in the process of proving that the Church-Turing conjecture is false. And mathematicians have been working on this for 60 years. So that's another thing that he's given me a little visibility into the really esoteric math side of things. The paper will be published. It's under peer review right now, but it's basically all the great mathematicians for the last 60 years have worked on this, and nobody's made progress to prove whether it's true or false. And it's basically about what you can compute on a machine, the kinds of numbers and the kinds of math that you can compute on a machine. Because a Turing machine, it halts and gives you an answer, but you don't know when it's going to halt. You don't know if you put in your algorithm that you want to make a calculation on and it runs for 4 days and gives you an answer, that's terrific. But if it's a very large orbital system and it needs to run for 10,000 years, you're never, in your lifetime, you're never going to get the answer. So the point is, the simple thing is the halting problem is whether a Turing machine will give an answer or not. And so that's what the Church-Turing conjecture is about, is what are the conditions that you can get a calculation result out of a Turing machine. So Fisk, in a clever way, added this dynamic register system to a Turing machine. It's 1,590 lines of code, and it's written in, which Lisp is it? A very clever Lisp that's very practical for this. I forgot what the name of it is. Anyways, a guy in Florida developed it. Okay, so that's Fisk. He also just recently got married and has a baby, so it's hard to get quality time to think about things. It's pretty funny, him trying to learn how to be a father. So I hear a lot of this on our talks. So, okay, here's the 10 requirements. I'll cover them, like I said, super brilliant guys came up with these. This is the first time that I'm actually kind of trying to go through them and cover them with a general audience. Forgive me if I'm not a super professional guy at understanding all the subtle details, but I'll just kind of go through them with you. So we've kind of already talked about requirement number 1, right? The host computer and network cannot be trusted. Do you guys all agree with that? So any security system is going to have to address that, right? So the notion is that you've got to divide up the ecosystem into parts that can be depended on and ones that you can't depend on, right? Trusted and untrusted, okay? The challenge is to build a transaction mechanism that doesn't have to rely on untrusted parts for integrity. And that's currently the situation that we have. Is that clear so far? Does that make sense? Good? For first one. Second one, this is really straightforward, right? So an operation that's running in an untrusted environment must be handled as a secure transaction. So that means that there has to be security there. And let's make sure I got this right. Any operation not run in a trusted environment, right, must be handled as a secure transaction. So that means if there's any part that's untrusted, that's the way that you've got to treat it this way. You can't keep anything plain text. You can't have anything exposed and available. So computers, in the longer point here, I just don't want to read this to you. Like I said, I'll give you the slides afterwards. It means we can't rely on authentication and authorization on an untrusted device. Okay, that makes sense. You can't operate or you can't execute secure operations on an untrusted environment. Okay, so now we need another approach. I think you guys would all agree. Okay, who votes for another approach? Yeah, I do, because that's what we're talking about here. So this is really the key here, and that's you create a new component that goes into the computing system that we'll call a secure module. There's been lots of discussions about modules. Wow, really? Wow, but I started late. Oh, wow, okay. I'm going to go really fast then. You guys can look. So anyways, the notion is creating a secure module. You do your authentication, okay, and the authorization originating from this module, okay? The module must be able to integrate with things. It must be able to send some kind of output to things, but it can't send anything related to authentication factors, anything static. It has to be completely a dynamic module. Okay? Every authorization operation must be coupled with an authentication operation. So that means that if you're going to receive an authentication from somebody on something, it means that you've got to have the authentication that that person really is who they are, and they do have the rights to initiate that authorization, that that is present in any kind of transaction or step that you're taking or operation. Is that clear? Yeah, good. Okay. This is a long slide, so I won't go into too much detail on this, but a security operations stack must be maintained, and information must never leak from a higher level to a lower level. Okay, I think this is pretty straightforward in your kind of understanding of network architecture. The next thing I'll cover here is just the list of priorities. Okay, a system must provide availability, authentication, integrity, confidentiality, authorization, and accounting. Availability is the highest priority on the list, but if you attack the availability, okay, it doesn't compromise the security transaction or the operation that you're trying to do. It may halt it, but it doesn't compromise it. Okay. Also, there has to be strong accounting within the system, and the accounting can never be compromised. That's your audit trail back to what happened. That's very important as well. Okay, authentication operations must be decentralized, while authorization operations must be centralized. Okay, if you keep tokens, any kind, like they do today on the server that you're logging into, you've got susceptibility to back-end compromise, to insider compromise of those systems. Even with their being encrypted, even maybe obfuscated, even maybe firewalled, even maybe hidden, even maybe broken into 8 parts, somebody knows how to stitch them together to get the bulk of data out and compromise the system. If you push the authentication tokens out to the user, okay, and keep them on a secure module, which we have a demonstration of this, which I brought along today, which is a single chip, okay, then you don't have any problem with centralized authentication factors being compromised. So it's a very important step. Authorization, though, you have to give the people at Server Central, especially in businesses and corporate environments or bank accounts, you have to give the authorization control to these guys. So push the authentication factors out to the edge and keep the authorization in the middle. So somebody in the middle at the server can shut off somebody's access, but they're never going to have access to any of their authentication factor tokens. Does that make sense? Okay. But sending a password to a server over the internet, we're pretty far away from that today, aren't we? So we got a ways to go. This is a real simple one. I already kind of stated this, and that is that all authentication factors have to be stored on the secure module, only in the secure module. Okay? That eliminates the problems that we've been talking about. Also, if the module is tampered with, the keys, tokens, or whatever's used, biometrics, pins, they must be destroyed. That's just kind of a logical, piece there. Okay, authentication must be seamlessly integrated to cryptographic operations. Okay, this is a little bit more technical, but the point is you have to have a seamless connection between the authentication process and the mechanisms of encryption, meaning you can't have any seam in that link. You can't have 2 or 3 steps that accomplish that. It has to be integrated into the secure module. So it's seamless. Okay, and last point, and that is that all authentication factors have to be entered directly into the secure module. Okay, that's the only thing you can trust in this environment. So they have to be entered into the secure module. Okay, the only thing that can come out of the module is a dynamic token, something that's always changing. This is going to eliminate your, back on cryptography on the previous slide, replay attacks. Even if it's encrypted, there's a lot of systems that are susceptible to replay attacks. The point being here is that only out of the module can come dynamic tokens that are only going to work once, and that are, there's nothing that can be reused about them. You know, one-time passcodes with the RSA tokens, that's been a reasonable security addition to the corporate environment for strong login. So one-time passcodes work well. They're using them on telephones now for banking, that kind of thing. So it's very nice. If you have a login and password, use the same thing for 5 years. Okay, somebody is going to be able to sniff it or use it. So the ideal thing would be users change their passwords every single time they use a system, but nobody does that. It's too complicated. That's the idea of using biometrics. If you put your thumb on it each time and it generates a new one-time passcode, I'm just deviating here, making it a little simpler, and it generates a one-time code, and that's the only way that it can get into the back-end system, then that has eliminated a whole lot of attacks that go on in typical kinds of systems. Because FISC has used a really elegant and obscure mathematical approach to the one-time passcode system, it's intractable. You can't get it. Okay, 1 minute or 0 minutes? No, so I'm done, see? Now here's the question. Do you guys want to see a working secure module? Because I brought one with me. So I'll go over to one of the tables over there after my talk, and then we can continue the talk. And that's it, questions. Oh, well, one last thing. If you guys want to get an 8-page white paper on this topic, the one that was actually extracted directly and written by Dr. Fisk and Martine, just contact me by this email address, and I will send a copy of it to you. Okay, questions? Okay, at a table later if you want to, because I'll do the secure module demonstration. So, okay, thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Feedback. So Mark mentioned SCADA, and actually our next talk is going to be about SCADA.
Wow,
myth
super.
Or fact. Actually, it's going to be precisely about that. Media stories. Oh my God, the North Koreans hacked BP. How much of that is true? What's the real risk? What's the real threat? How much of it is just hype? So if you're interested in that, be back in 5 minutes. Okay. And then Anchises de Paula is going to talk about SCADA.
Okay, so maybe I will do the module demonstration in an hour, because I actually am really curious about this, and I had no idea this talk was going on. Things just happen like that sometimes, yes?
Yeah, it's lovely when it
I
happens.
probably really bastardized the topic, so I apologize to the next speaker if I bastardized the topic.
Right. Okay, so be back in 5 minutes. Thank you.